Hello, and welcome to a discussion on the first part of Jane Eyre. This section will focus on the abuse that Jane Eyre received by the hands of her benefactor, Mrs. Reed, her children, and the servants. It is clear that most of them feel no love toward or interest in her life at the Gateshead residence. They consider Jane a nuisance thrust upon them by the inconvenience of a dead mother and father, who happen to be related to their now deceased husband and father of the household. There are some positive feelings from the young governess Bessie shown and expressed for her, but she too seems stuck in the house culture, not able to acknowledge the viciousness and bad treatment. Jane Eyre does her best to cope with the abuse in ways very much similar to all those who find themselves in abusive relationships. There are patterns and responses that resonate up through current times with abuse and victims. First, a few notes on the author and why she would call it an autobiography. Of course, that usually means it is a personal view of life as lived by that person telling the story. In this case, it is not the life of Charlotte Bronte or the existence of any woman named Jane Eyre. The novel is complete fiction. Knowing this, why would it be called an autobiography? There might be a few reasons, mostly due to the time period it was written. Women were not supposed to be authors up through the Victorian era when Charlotte Bronte was living. Presenting it as an autobiography might have given the author more room to publish it without a lot of backlash. She was claiming to present a true narrative. Even though the character didn't exist and almost all of the story is fiction, a lot of the general kinds of places and circumstances, particularly up until the latter portion of the story, was within Charlotte's experiences. For example, she did attend boarding school, she was a teacher, and she was a governess. Therefore, in some ways, it is an autobiography of a loose sort about the author's life. How much is fiction and how much is real can only be guessed at. There's not much from Bronte's life to indicate she was abused in the same way as her character Jane Eyre, although she probably knew those who were. She did spend some time, as was mentioned, in schools and households as both student and teacher. She probably heard things and witnessed a few incidents. As for her own life, there's no indication that Charlotte Bronte herself was abused. I suppose some critics could look at the book and decide that the details indicate that there was some kind of strife within her own life. That would, of course, be pure speculation without more evidence. Going back to the novel, it doesn't start at the beginning of Jane Eyre's abuse, but when she decides to assert herself and protect against bodily harm. The opening already has dread and a loneliness despite living among a tight-knit family. Mother and children have gathered around a chair, but Jane Eyre has been cut off from the simple gathering around the fireplace. Instead, Mrs. Reed has her sitting somewhere else, away from them. It is a complete abandonment and total neglect. Jane Eyre tries to understand what she might have done wrong, asking a question, what she was accused of doing. She feels very much punished for no reason. Mrs. Reed considers the very asking of why she is treated so poorly as evidence of her poor behavior. As was typical of the time, children were to be seen and not heard. And, above that, children are not to question what adults do to them or with them. This is keeping the victim quiet by not answering their questions and why the abuse is happening. And it gives more power to the abuser while keeping the victims questioning their own innocence. They will start to feel guilty of things that they have no idea what they should be guilty of. After all, there has to be some reason why the cruelty is aimed at them. There cannot be a power struggle or the authority of the abuser might be threatened. It is, after all, about having power over a person, or in this case, a young child. And Mrs. Reed is not the only one doing the abusing by any means, as her children follow after her example. No one is meaner to her physically than her boy John. It doesn't seem that John is much older than Jane Eyre. In fact, he's about 4 years older. But he still possesses a considerable threat. John finds Jane Eyre sitting away from everything, reading a book quietly, trying to stay out of trouble. It seemed to be exactly what the family wanted. But the boy wanted more. He wanted control. So Jane was doing both the learned behavior that was expected of her by staying away from the family and also using that as a way to protect against harm. But it didn't matter what she did to protect herself because John, in this case, wanted to assert his authority. He made sure to exclaim that he owned the book she was reading, that he belonged in the home, that she didn't, that where she sat was part of that home, and with that information implied that he owned her. Since he was not the adult of the family with the same social position, he chose instead to inflict physical pain. He had done it for so long that Jane knew exactly what was coming. She dreaded the expected harm, but was used to it enough to allow him, for the moment, his actions. Although in the past Jane apparently gave him a free pass to treat her with physical abuse, there was something this time that made her snap. Perhaps it was the accumulation of so many times that he hurt her, or maybe the pain was far worse than ever was inflicted on her before. He did draw some blood, even if the book doesn't indicate that was the first time. He had done more than treat her badly, but attacked her during her most precious and private time. She was alone, reading a book, wanting to not associate with anyone. It was an escape from a terrible life. So the intrusion and attack was a promise that there would never be any kind of rest. So what she had to do was lash out in frustration. Now that should have taught a boy a lesson in treating others harshly. There is a saying that if you punch a bully in the nose hard enough, they'll run away. But he responded like a most habitual abuser. It was a challenge to his superiority, and nothing less than a complete beating would be necessary to teach her a lesson that he was the one in control. She could never be allowed to protect herself. Jane is lucky to be alive. John definitely wanted to try to kill her. In fact, Jane describes him as a murderer and tyrant who cares for no one other than himself. We cannot take Jane Eyre completely at her word as to what kind of a person John is, but there is plenty of evidence she gives to support the serious allegations. This includes cruelty to animals, to other humans, and a disregard for his mother. Even someone as morally questionable as Mrs. Reed. He does seem to have a classic psychotic personality. Her rescue at the same time opens her up to even more abuse at the hand of the boy and the others. John does what is called gaslighting to Jane. He tells lies about what happened, putting the blame completely on Jane's head. Because everyone else is sympathetic to him, they believe him above her. So the other family members are so good at coming up with coloring Jane's behavior as wrong, even though she's most likely defending herself, that the mother and servants automatically disbelieve her. She has become to them a raving liar. She has been transformed into what they are. Because they don't believe her and consider her the one who started the fight, she is sent up to a room that is metaphorically death, as well as having death lingering in its history. Meaning to or not, sending her upstairs is a death sentence. The room is described as a mausoleum. It was large and stately, with a bed supported by massive pillars that stood out like a tabernacle. All around was the two colors of red and white, most associated with death. Red curtains around the bed and across the windows, with a red carpet and a red cloth across a table at the end of the bed. What wasn't red was white. The bedspread, pillows, and a sitting chair were white like snow. The feeling of the room was no less dark, cold, and abandoned as a tomb. All of the imagery is to sort of punctuate that she was sent to her death. Not only that, but there was real death that happened here. Within the room, her uncle died. That would play a large role in how she would feel while locked up in the room. Considering the head trauma described in John's attack when she tried to protect herself, she most likely suffered a concussion. This would explain why she started imagining the ghost of her father's brother with such a feeling of him really haunting the room. She looked out the window, saw this ghost come to her, and was very much afraid. Then she caught sickness. She took very sick and actually did from the worry expressed by the house servants, almost die. In serious enough abuse cases where the victim goes to the doctor, all kinds of stories are made up by those involved to cover up the violence. As for Jane Eyre, a Mr. Lloyd was called in to take care of her in her sickness. He asked what had happened to her, and in the most classic of responses was answered by Bessie that she had taken a fall. Even though she was 10 years old, she was treated by the household and even the doctor as if she was a very young child. Mr. Lloyd might have suspected she wasn't treated very well, but her story of seeing a ghost, again probably set in by a concussion, was evidence that she really was mentally and emotionally a lot younger than her actual age. Jane clung on to him as if he was her best hope of a horrible escape, but he was slightly more caring than the others, still not believing a word she said. All witnesses spoke against her, and her own words were used against her very character. One would think or believe that after all she had gone through, the best course of action was to run away. If she was more of an adult, that might have been a reasonable suggestion. Jane at this point was still a young child, if not, as they considered her, an infant. There was no place for her to go without needing any kind of help. This fact was used against her. With yet another classic experience of victims, the abusers threatened that if they leave, then life would be far worse. Mrs. Reed and Bessie warned Jane that outside of Gateshead, she will find nothing but poverty and depravity. They were very exact in describing all the horrors and immorality to be found among the lives of the poor. Those living in poverty were not to them people in an economic condition, but a personal and moral decay of humanity. Even if poverty was not a sign of degeneracy, it certainly would lead to that. Jane Eyre took that as truth, and beyond the abuse she experienced on a daily basis, there was no horror worse than living without money. Threats that leaving from an abusive relationship has not, up until this day, changed. Depression was a side companion of abuse for the young Jane Eyre. With no friends and no family, all she had was moments alone or some small comforts every now and then. She didn't mind not mingling with the family after a while, since it was better than ill treatment. The one good in her life was the governess Bessie, who comforted her and sang some beautiful songs. Those moments, even with her, were short-lived. More often, Bessie was chiding her right along with the family, considering her different and a bit uncivilized. She had a job to do, and siding with Jane, who she did often think of in positive terms, such as being a strong girl, would endanger her employment. Jane Eyre, surrounded by people, was sad, lonely, confused, and depressed. Excitement for Jane Eyre arrived in the form of a boarding school authority, with the opportunity to leave the abusive household. That excitement quickly turned to dread when the rumors of Jane's bad behavior were emphasized by Mrs. Reed as a reason to send her away. She was blackened by Mrs. Reed in front of another hope of escape. To make matters worse, she was handing Jane over to an institution that thought like Mrs. Reed in handling children. There was a certain social and economic place for the less fortunate that insisted they remain humble in both person and property. Those with money, on the other hand, could wear silk dresses while admiring the austerity of the poor around them. Poverty was good for the poor so long as the rich could keep them under control and taught to know what their place was in the world. So for those who couldn't cope with their condition or spoke up for better treatment, such as Jane Eyre, they were considered wicked and untrustworthy. Abuse for Jane extended wider than the immediate place she resided, but all around her in the social world of Victorian England. Her goal was to break out of the cycle and become something better than the poor child taken in by a careless family. She has a very long way to go. Click the subscribe button and notification bell to not miss the next installments and analysis.